Still, the wheelchair wheels scraped against the airport floor when my son pointed at me and said, "Wheel her to the corner, she's embarrassing." As I stared straight ahead, I didn't protest or cry, calm on the outside while my stomach dropped. While the wheels kept scraping, that sound felt louder than his voice, louder than the crowd rushing past. The same scraping followed me as I realized he didn't say it by accident. He said it without hesitation. That's when I understood the humiliation wasn't new. It was something I'd been quietly carrying for years. That's when I decided I would never let my silence be his permission again. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The airport buzzed with movement, people hurrying, voices calling, and the clatter of luggage wheels against tile. Sarah sat in her wheelchair trying to steady herself as the wheelchair assistant steered her through the crowd. She felt exposed, as though every glance cast in her direction was a reminder of the independence she had lost. Ethan and Emily walked ahead, their figures cutting through the throngs of people with ease, their pace quickening as they navigated the terminal. Sarah could see them up ahead, Ethan's broad back, his suit jacket bouncing with each step. She tried to catch up, but her wheelchair barely moved as fast. She could feel the weight of Ethan's impatience on her, the tension in his posture as he glanced back, sighing with barely contained frustration. "Come on, Mom, we're late," he called over his shoulder. The words stung, more than they should have. She knew he was under pressure. She knew he had a life to get back to. But still, the sharpness in his voice felt like a slap to her. She had raised him to be better than this, to care, to be patient. But here he was, treating her like an inconvenience. The wheelchair assistant slowed, careful not to bump into anyone as they rounded a corner. Sarah felt her heart race, her mind reeling. She wasn't supposed to need this kind of help, but her body had betrayed her, and now she had no choice. She hated it. As they approached a small seating area, Ethan turned back again, annoyance evident in his eyes. "Wheel her to the corner, she's embarrassing." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her vision blurred for a moment, and she felt the sting of humiliation flood her chest. Embarrassing. The word echoed in her head, louder than the din of the airport. She blinked, trying to push the sting away, but it remained, gnawing at her insides. The wheelchair assistant glanced at her, his face unreadable, before continuing to push her toward a row of chairs near the gate. But Sarah didn't see the chairs. She didn't see anything. All she could see was the hurt in Ethan's face, the disgust in his voice. Her own son had just called her an embarrassment. Emily, walking just a few steps ahead, glanced back at Sarah. Her face was tight, her lips pressed together. She looked uncomfortable, but said nothing, offering no support, no apology. Sarah wanted to scream, wanted to ask Emily what she thought of all this, why she hadn't said anything, but she stayed silent, her heart breaking in quiet pieces. The wheelchair assistant helped her settle into a seat, but Sarah barely noticed. Ethan and Emily were already disappearing into the crowd, their backs turned, and Sarah could feel the space between them stretching farther and farther. She looked up at Grace, who had been trailing behind, watching everything unfold in silence. "Are you all right, Sarah?" Grace's voice was soft, but it cut through the fog of Sarah's thoughts. Sarah shook her head, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know anymore." The noise of the airport seemed to blur into a distant hum as Sarah sat motionless in the waiting area. She was alone, but the silence around her felt heavy, suffocating. Her hands gripped the armrests of the wheelchair, knuckles white, as though holding on to something solid could anchor her in this sea of humiliation. Ethan and Emily were already out of sight, their figures swallowed by the crowd. The space between them was vast, immeasurably so. Grace, who had quietly followed them after the incident, now sat beside Sarah. Her presence was a soft contrast to the harshness of Sarah's thoughts. Grace didn't speak at first, sensing that silence was all Sarah could handle right now. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, the kind that hung heavy but couldn't be voiced. Sarah could feel Grace's gaze on her, a quiet understanding in it, but even that wasn't enough to soothe the ache inside. Grace finally broke the silence with a gentle sigh. "He didn't mean it like that," she said, her voice soft, almost apologetic. Sarah's eyes stayed fixed on the floor, the words floating around her without fully registering. He didn't mean it. The words felt empty now, like a tired excuse. She had heard this from him before. "It was a joke, Mom. You're being too sensitive." How many times had she excused his behavior, dismissed his rudeness as something forgivable? Too many times, she realized. This time, though, it felt different. It felt like a line had been crossed. She finally looked up at Grace, the raw emotion on her face evident. "Did you hear him?" she asked quietly, the words barely making it past the lump in her throat. "Did you hear what he said?" Grace nodded slowly, her eyes soft with sympathy. "I did. But maybe you need to hear it from him." Sarah shook her head, her chest tight. "I don't know if I can." She took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. The truth was, she didn't want to hear it from him. The damage felt too deep, too final. She had spent years trying to be the strong one, trying to be the mother who could handle anything. But now, in front of the world, in front of strangers, she had been made to feel like a burden, a source of embarrassment. And Ethan had done it without hesitation. A deep, uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Sarah's thoughts drifted back to the past, back to the years she had raised Ethan, the days when he was small and the world had seemed so much simpler. She remembered the laughter, the way he had looked up at her with trust and admiration. But now, all she felt was distance. The illness had taken so much from her, and in the process, it seemed to have taken Ethan as well. Was this really the son she had raised? Had he always been like this? Or had it all changed when her body started failing her? Grace gave her a moment, letting the quiet soak in. She was patient, but Sarah could feel her discomfort too. "You've always been strong," Grace said gently, as if she were trying to offer a lifeline. "Maybe it's time you let him see how much you hurt." The words stung, but they also felt like a wake-up call. For so long, Sarah had swallowed her pain, kept it hidden behind a smile or a quiet acceptance. But today, Ethan had seen something in her that made him turn away. Or worse, something he had never seen before. She looked out at the terminal, watching families hustle past, people lost in their own worlds. No one knew what she was feeling, what had just happened to her. But Grace knew, and deep down, Sarah knew that she couldn't ignore it anymore. Emily's footsteps approached, soft but deliberate. She stood for a moment, not sure whether to sit or stay standing, her hands twisting together nervously. Then, in a voice so soft it barely reached Sarah's ears, Emily whispered, "I'm sorry, Sarah. I should have said something. I should have stopped him." The words didn't feel like an apology, more like a Band-Aid on a wound that had gone too deep. But Emily was trying, Sarah could see that. It was too little. Too late, though. Ethan's words had already carved a jagged line between them. She looked at Emily, the sympathy in her eyes now mingled with a quiet sadness. Sarah swallowed, trying to find her voice, but it wouldn't come. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the terminal, the churning crowd that seemed to move without care or notice. "I don't know what to do," Sarah admitted, her voice cracking. "I don't know when I'll be able to face him." She didn't know when or how, but one thing was clear. This was the moment that had changed everything. She wasn't sure if she could ever forgive him, but one thing was certain. She couldn't go back to being the person she was before. The thought hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The woman she had been was gone, and who she would become now was uncertain. But one thing Sarah knew, deep down, was that she wouldn't be humiliated again. The silence that followed was pregnant with the weight of that decision. Sarah sat, motionless in the waiting area, the air around her buzzing with noise. But inside, she felt like she was drowning in silence. Ethan was still a few seats away, glued to his phone, oblivious to her presence. His back was turned, his focus on whatever message had captured his attention. Her hands gripped the armrests of the wheelchair, as though that was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. She stared at the ground, her mind replaying the harsh words he had thrown at her. Embarrassing. How many times had he dismissed her like this? The realization hit her with an unexpected force. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was the culmination of years of small, quiet dismissals. His impatience with her illness, his disregard for her needs, his refusal to see her as anything other than a burden. She felt Grace's gaze, the comforting weight of her presence. Grace had been there for her, always. But Sarah couldn't seem to shake the cold sting of what had just happened. Ethan didn't even look up. How long had it been since he really saw me? The thought lingered in her mind, settling like a stone in her chest. The times he'd brushed off her requests for help, the way he'd avoided her when she needed him the most. Sarah had let it go, each time, telling herself it was a phase. But today, the weight of all those little slights had crushed her. And now, there was no pretending it didn't matter. Grace spoke gently, her voice soft but firm. "Maybe it's time, Sarah. You've been strong for so long, but you don't have to carry this alone anymore." Her words were like a small spark. Sarah felt a flicker of hope, a recognition that maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop pretending that everything was fine. But the thought of confronting Ethan felt impossible. How could she even begin to address what had just happened? And more importantly, how could she face him after everything he had taken from her? Before she could answer, Emily appeared at her side. She stood there for a moment, unsure, before softly murmuring, "I'm sorry, Sarah. I should have said something. I should have stopped him." The apology fell flat. It wasn't enough, not after everything, not after Ethan's words. Sarah could feel the space between them widening, the crack in their relationship too deep to mend with a few words. "No," Sarah said, her voice surprising even herself. "I can't just let it go, Emily. Not this time." Grace's eyes softened with understanding. "You don't have to. You've carried this for too long already." Ethan's voice, loud and detached, cut through the moment, and Sarah turned her head slightly. He was still lost in his phone, his world untouched by the storm raging just a few feet away. Her chest tightened as the truth became clearer than ever. She had to speak up. She had to confront him, no matter how hard it would be. This silence, this distance, it couldn't continue. For the first time in a long while, Sarah knew what she had to do. The moment had come. She couldn't go back. The weight of Sarah's thoughts pressed on her, thick and suffocating. As she sat in the sterile waiting area, the hum of the airport felt distant, as though the world had continued on without her, leaving her suspended in a painful moment. She hadn't spoken to Ethan yet. The quiet around her was both a relief and a burden, a space where her own mind ran wild with questions that had no answers. What happened to my son? The questions echoed in her mind, sharp and relentless. She glanced at him again, his head bent over his phone, completely unaware of the storm raging beside him. She had always known that Ethan could be impatient, even distant at times. But this was something else. This wasn't the son she had raised. This was someone unrecognizable, a stranger who treated her like a burden. She had always thought that once her illness passed, things would return to normal. But with each passing day, she saw a new version of him, one that she didn't know how to reach. Had I failed him? The thought gnawed at her. Sarah had always prided herself on being a good mother, strong, capable, there for Ethan when he needed her. She had raised him with love, with the hope that he would grow into a man who respected her as much as she had respected him. But now, in the face of his indifference, All that love seemed to count for nothing. Grace had been quietly sitting beside her, watching Sarah's internal struggle unfold. After a while, she placed a hand gently on Sarah's arm. "I know this is hard, but you have to ask yourself, what role do you want to play in Ethan's life now?" Grace's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable weight to it, as though she were speaking from experience. Sarah turned to her, her chest tightening. "What role do I play in his life now?" That was the question that had no easy answer. She wasn't just his mother anymore. She wasn't even someone he wanted to acknowledge, let alone respect. She felt like she had become an afterthought in his life, a person whose needs and feelings were no longer important. "You can't let this define you," Grace continued, her voice low and steady. "You don't have to let his actions determine your worth." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing something vital, her connection to Ethan. The closeness they once shared, the bond they had built over years of shared moments, was now slipping through her fingers. It was like a quiet erosion, small at first, unnoticed, until one day it was too late to stop. Her mind drifted back to earlier years, before her diagnosis, before the slow and steady breakdown of her body. Back then, Ethan had been different. He had laughed easily, trusted her without question. She had been his anchor, the person he turned to in moments of doubt. But now, it felt as if that trust had been replaced with disdain, as though everything she had been to him no longer mattered. The moments that haunted her were the ones where she had tried to ask for help, when her illness had first become too much for her to manage alone. "I'm fine, Mom. Just relax," he would say, brushing her off, not realizing how much that hurt. The subtle ways he belittled her, as though she were some inconvenience. Was it always this way? Or had it gotten worse? She didn't know, but she felt like she was unraveling the truth bit by bit, a truth that was more painful than she could bear. Grace was watching her closely, her face etched with concern. "Sarah," she said, her voice soft, "I know you're hurting, but you need to ask yourself, are you willing to let this go? Are you willing to let Ethan's choices define your relationship forever?" Sarah closed her eyes, her heart heavy with the weight of it all. Let it go? Could she? Could she continue to let Ethan walk all over her, to dismiss her as though she were nothing more than a problem to be dealt with? The anger, the betrayal, the confusion, they all swirled inside her, and the walls she had so carefully built around her emotions began to crack. She wasn't sure what was left between them. Was it love? Or was it just years of habit, of trying to hold on to something that was no longer there? The unanswered questions grew louder, threatening to drown her in uncertainty. Ethan's behavior had changed so much, but had it been building up all along? Had she missed the signs, too busy holding on to hope? She wasn't sure anymore. As the silence stretched on, Sarah knew one thing for sure. She couldn't keep living in this limbo. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. The moment of truth was coming, whether she was ready or not. Her heart hammered in her chest, but a quiet voice inside her urged her forward. It's time to stop asking questions and start finding answers. The question now wasn't whether she could confront Ethan, it was whether she could face the truth of what had become of their relationship. And that truth was more daunting than anything she had ever faced before. The air between them crackled with tension. Sarah could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she wheeled herself closer to Ethan, who was still absorbed in his phone. The hum of the terminal felt distant, muted, as if the world had slowed down around her. This moment, this confrontation, had been coming for far too long. "Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it cut through the haze of silence that surrounded them. He didn't look up, didn't even acknowledge her. "Ethan," she said again, this time firmer, and he sighed, dragging his hand through his hair as he finally glanced at her. "What, Mom?" His tone was sharp, impatient. "I'm busy." Sarah's throat tightened. She had expected this. She had prepared for it. But still, the sting of his indifference cut deeper than she had anticipated. "I want to talk about what happened earlier, at the airport." He glanced at her briefly, annoyance flickering in his eyes. "What?" "Oh, that. It was just a joke, Mom," he said, waving his hand dismissively as if it were no big deal. "You're being too sensitive." Her hands gripped the armrests of her wheelchair, knuckles white with the force of her restraint. "It wasn't a joke, Ethan. You humiliated me. You told the assistant to wheel me to the corner like I was some burden to hide away." Ethan rolled his eyes and sighed again. "Oh, come on. I didn't mean anything by it. You're always overreacting. I didn't say anything bad." Sarah's heart sank. The casual dismissal of her feelings made her blood run cold. This wasn't the first time he dismissed her, but something in her snapped. She had endured years of these little moments, his impatience, his indifference, but today she wasn't willing to let it slide. "No, Ethan," she said, her voice hard now. "It's not just about this one thing. It's about all the times you've brushed me off, belittled me when I needed you. I don't deserve that, and I'm not going to pretend I do anymore." He shifted in his seat, his eyes now avoiding hers as he muttered, "You're making a big deal out of nothing. I don't have time for this." Her stomach churned with the realization that he didn't even care enough to listen. "You never listen," she said quietly. "You don't respect me anymore. Not even when I'm trying to have a real conversation with you." Ethan's face hardened, and his voice rose in irritation. "You're being too sensitive, Mom. It was just a joke. You always make things harder than they need to be." The words hit her like a slap. Too sensitive. She had spent years worrying about his feelings, excusing his behavior. But in that moment, Sarah knew the truth. Ethan didn't respect her. Not really. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I'm done letting you treat me this way," she said, the weight of the words sinking in. She wasn't sure where this would lead, but it was clear now. Nothing would ever be the same. As the silence stretched between them, Sarah realized that the confrontation she had been avoiding was finally here. The question wasn't if she would stand up to him. It was whether Ethan would ever see her as more than a burden. The confrontation with Ethan had been a watershed moment for Sarah, a line drawn in the sand that she could no longer cross back over. As she sat in the quiet aftermath, the weight of what had just unfolded began to settle in. She felt both lighter and heavier at once, the air around her thick with uncertainty and possibility. Ethan had never understood the depth of her pain, and after today she realized he likely never would. But that was no longer her burden to bear. Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. She hadn't allowed herself the luxury of thinking about her own needs for far too long, always prioritizing Ethan's, her friends', even Emily's. It was time to reclaim some of that space. She pulled out her phone and made the call she had been avoiding for months. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the number, the small action feeling like the first step toward something new. "Good afternoon, Sarah. How can I help you today?" The financial advisor's voice crackled through the speaker. "I need to reassess my finances," Sarah said, her voice clear despite the storm inside her. "It's time to take a step back and plan for the future." She felt a sense of quiet empowerment as they scheduled the meeting. She wasn't just going to sit back and let her circumstances control her anymore. The financial uncertainty, the reliance on others. She was taking control. She needed to know where she stood, what options were open to her, what she could do on her own. The next day, Sarah sat down with the advisor in a bright, neutral office. The numbers, the spreadsheets, they were all unfamiliar, intimidating. But as the conversation unfolded, Sarah realized how little she had known about her own life. The illness, the dependency, had taken up so much space in her mind that she had neglected everything else. As the meeting wrapped up, the advisor handed her a new budget, a roadmap for a future that was hers to create. "You'll be all right, Sarah," the advisor said, offering a reassuring smile. "You've got this." Walking out of the office, Sarah felt like she was stepping into a new world, one that she hadn't considered for a long time, the world where she was in charge. Later that evening, Emily came over, her face a picture of concern. "Sarah, I know you're upset, but you need to be careful. Are you sure this is the right time to make such big changes?" Her voice was gentle but insistent. "I'm sure," Sarah replied, her voice steady, unwavering. She had made the decision. This was her time. She wasn't going to wait for Ethan or for anyone to approve of her choices. "I've spent too many years putting everyone else first. It's time for me to think about what I need." Emily paused, studying her for a moment. "I just don't want you to make hasty decisions. You don't have to go through this alone." Sarah nodded. "I know I don't have to. I have Grace, and I have myself. That's enough." Emily remained quiet for a long moment, the concern in her eyes mingling with a sense of helplessness. Sarah understood. Emily had always tried to be the peacemaker, the buffer between Sarah and Ethan, but Sarah wasn't looking for peace anymore. She was looking for a life she could own, a life where her needs were just as important as anyone else's. That evening, as she sat in the quiet of her apartment, Sarah began making plans for her first solo trip. A week in the mountains. A place to think, to breathe, to be alone without the weight of expectations, of familial obligations. It was a simple but deeply personal decision. She would pack her bags, book the tickets, and set off on her own. For the first time in a long while, she felt excitement, a spark of freedom that she hadn't felt in years. Grace called that night, and Sarah could hear the smile in her voice when she answered. "I'm proud of you," Grace said simply. "You deserve this. You've worked so hard for everyone else. Now it's your turn." The sincerity in Grace's words resonated deep within Sarah. It was more than just taking back control of her finances or planning a trip. It was about redefining her life. She wasn't defined by her illness, by Ethan's disregard, or by any of the things she had allowed to define her for so long. The evening felt like a turning point. Sarah was no longer just drifting through her life, reacting to what others said and did. She was moving forward, making choices based on her own desires. The weight she had carried for so long was finally beginning to lift, and in its place was a clarity she had never known. The future was hers, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah was ready to meet it on her own terms. The morning air was cool against Sarah's skin as she stepped outside, the weight of her suitcase finally feeling like a symbol of freedom rather than burden. She had packed her life into a bag, but it wasn't just clothes and necessities she was carrying. It was a fresh start, a new beginning. Grace stood beside her, her smile warm but knowing. "Ready?" she asked, the words laced with quiet excitement. "Ready," Sarah replied, the word tasting sweeter than she expected. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she truly felt this way, ready for something new, ready to let go of the past. The flight was smooth, the hours passing like a blur of gentle conversations and the quiet hum of the plane. When they landed, the cold mountain air greeted Sarah with a welcome sharpness, cutting through the fog that had clouded her mind for so long. The vastness of the landscape ahead felt almost overwhelming, but it wasn't fear she felt, it was exhilaration. As they drove toward their cabin, Sarah felt the quiet settle in around her. The noise of the world, of her old life, seemed far away. There was only the sound of Grace's voice, the hum of the car's engine, and the occasional crunch of snow beneath the tires. The mountains were the perfect contrast to the life she had left behind. Here, she could breathe. Here, she could think. The cabin was simple, small, tucked away in the woods, but it felt like a sanctuary, a place where Sarah could finally hear her own thoughts without the constant pull of obligations or expectations. As she stepped inside, she took a long, deep breath, her senses flooded with the smell of wood and pine. She had never felt so fully alive. Over the next few days, Sarah and Grace explored the trails that wound through the forest, their conversations flowing as easily as the mountain streams. They talked about the past, but more importantly, they talked about the future, Sarah's future. There was a freedom in not having to explain herself, in not having to justify her choices. Each day, Sarah felt herself opening up, shedding layers she had worn for so long. She hadn't realized how much of herself she had buried beneath the weight of others' expectations, Ethan's, Emily's, society's. But now, in this place, there were no judgments, no roles to play. There was only the woman she was, and the woman she was becoming. One evening, sitting by the fire, Grace turned to her with a smile. "I'm proud of you, Sarah. I can see the change in you. You're starting to remember who you really are." Sarah smiled back, her eyes bright. "I think I'm finally starting to remember, too." For the first time in years, Sarah felt something she hadn't in a long while. Hope. Hope for the future. Hope for herself. The mountains had given her something precious, the space to find herself again. And as the days passed, Sarah knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The first morning, Sarah woke up in the cabin with a new sense of purpose. She stood by the window and looked out at the mountains. The air was still crisp, the snow-covered trees standing tall against the rising sun. It was breathtakingly peaceful. But more than that, it felt like the beginning of something entirely her own. The distance from Ethan, from everything that had held her in place for so long, had started to feel natural. At first, the quiet had unsettled her, making her feel like she was drifting without direction. But now, the silence was her sanctuary. Grace had been her steadfast companion on this journey, but as the days passed, Sarah began to realize how much of herself she had lost in the lives of others. She had spent so long caring for Ethan, for Emily, for everyone else. Now, it was her turn. The idea of saying no felt strange at first. She had always been the one to give, to make sure others were happy. Now, as she spent more time reflecting on herself, it became clear how often she had put others' needs ahead of her own. One evening, after a hike through the forest, Sarah sat down with Grace over mugs of hot tea in their small cabin. Grace had been a quiet support throughout her journey, never pushing, just being there. "I've been thinking about all the times I've said yes when I should have said no," Sarah admitted, staring into the steam rising from her mug. "I've let others take up space in my life, and it's time I start reclaiming it." Grace nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "It's not easy, Sarah, but you're doing it. You're finally putting yourself first." Sarah smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. It feels strange, but also freeing. The days in the mountains began to blend together, long walks through the woods, quiet moments by the fire, and deep, honest conversations with Grace. It was a stark contrast to the noise and chaos that had once defined her life. And just as her confidence began to settle, Sarah found herself seeking more. New people, new experiences. On a particularly crisp morning, Sarah attended her first self-help group meeting at a small community center. She had never imagined herself in such a group, but something about hearing other people share their struggles resonated deeply with her. As she listened to their stories of loss, of betrayal, of rebuilding, Sarah realized she wasn't alone. There were others who had been hurt, others who had fought to find themselves again. It was humbling and liberating at the same time. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel vulnerable. She began attending more meetings, each one helping her stitch together pieces of herself that had been forgotten. She wasn't the only one who had lived a life of expectation, of being invisible to those closest to her. It became clear that her story had value, not just for her, but for others too. Months later, Sarah found herself standing in front of a small crowd at a local event, her heart racing with the thrill of something unfamiliar. She had been invited to speak about her journey, about the emotional toll of caring for others at the expense of her own needs. She had never thought of herself as a public speaker, but there she was, sharing her story. The words came easily, flowing from a place deep inside her, her own experiences, her own pain. The room was filled with strangers, yet Sarah felt a connection, a unity that transcended the distance between them. As she finished speaking, the room was silent for a moment, and then a wave of applause filled the air. Sarah stood there, her chest tight, her pulse quickening. It wasn't just the applause that moved her, it was the realization that she had done something she had never thought possible. She had turned her pain into strength, and now she was giving it back to the world. Later that night, as she walked back to her cabin, the weight of the moment settled around her. Ethan's absence, once a gaping hole in her heart, no longer defined her. She had carved out a space for herself, one that didn't require validation from anyone else. And then, as she unlocked the door to her cabin, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Ethan. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened. I'm sorry for everything, Mom. I miss you." Sarah stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keys. She had come so far, and yet this message, so simple, so heartfelt, stirred something deep inside her. She wasn't sure what the future held or if she could ever truly reconcile with him. But in that moment, she realized that whatever happened, she had found something far more important, her own voice. And that was enough. The quiet hum of the cabin surrounded Sarah as she sat by the fire, the flickering flames casting shadows on the walls. It was late, and the mountains outside were still and cold, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the space she had created for herself. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, a soft vibration breaking through the peaceful stillness. She picked it up, her fingers lingering for a moment before unlocking the screen. The message was from Ethan. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened. I'm sorry for everything, Mom. I miss you." For a long moment, Sarah just stared at the words, her breath caught in her chest. It had been months since she'd last heard from him, months since the confrontation at the airport had left a deep, jagged scar between them. Ethan's absence had forced her to confront the quiet ache of their relationship, but now his message stirred something inside her that she hadn't expected. Something tender, something unsettling. She had worked so hard to carve out a life where his absence no longer haunted her. She had learned to live without the need for his validation, without seeking his approval. She wasn't sure she was ready to go back, to reopen the wound that had caused so much pain. Yet, there it was, his apology. With a steadying breath, Sarah composed her response. "Thank you for your message, Ethan. I've been thinking a lot, too." She paused before adding the final line, something she hadn't been able to admit to herself before. "I don't know what to do with all of this yet, but I appreciate your words." The message sent, and she set the phone down, her mind racing. A sense of exhaustion settled over her as she leaned back into the couch, her gaze drifting to the flames. Part of her wanted to believe that this was the beginning of healing, that they could mend the space between them. But another part of her, one she didn't want to acknowledge, wondered if it was possible to go back to how things were. The silence in the cabin grew heavier, almost suffocating, as Sarah wrestled with her thoughts. She had worked so hard to rebuild herself, to find her voice, to stop being defined by the shadow of Ethan's neglect. Could she really forgive him? Could she move past the years of his disregard and step into a new chapter where their relationship was anything but a burden? The sound of the door creaking open interrupted her thoughts. Grace stepped inside, shaking off the cold. Sarah hadn't told her about Ethan's message yet, and the warmth of her presence was a welcome distraction. "Everything all right?" Grace asked, noting the intensity in Sarah's expression. Sarah looked up, a small, uncertain smile forming on her lips. "I just got a message from Ethan. He apologized." Grace didn't ask for details, but her face softened with understanding. "How do you feel about it?" I don't know, Sarah confessed, her voice quiet. Part of me wants to believe it, to believe that maybe this is the first step toward healing, but another part of me wonders if it's enough, if it even matters. Grace sat down next to her, her hand resting gently on Sarah's. You've come so far, Sarah. This isn't about fixing the past. It's about what you need now. I know, Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion. But what if forgiving him means going back to something that was never healthy? What if I let him back in and I just end up hurting again? Grace didn't answer immediately, instead letting the question hang in the air. Sarah had spent so many years trying to keep everything together, always putting others first, always excusing the things she shouldn't. But now, for the first time in her life, she was learning what it meant to prioritize herself, to choose peace over the constant noise of expectations. I'm not sure what forgiveness means anymore, Sarah said, more to herself than to Grace. But I do know that I can't erase everything that's happened. Healing doesn't mean going back to the way things were. It's about moving forward. I've worked so hard to get here. Grace nodded, a quiet pride in her eyes. Exactly. And you don't have to make any decisions today. Take your time. You've already come so far. The words settled in Sarah's chest like a soft balm, the tension in her body slowly easing. For the first time in months, she didn't feel the pressure to fix everything at once. Healing wasn't a linear path. It wasn't about erasing the past, but about making peace with it. She could move forward without carrying the weight of everything that had come before. The phone buzzed again, breaking the silence once more. Sarah hesitated before picking it up. Ethan had sent another message. I know I've let you down. I don't expect things to go back to normal overnight. I just want to start fresh, when you're ready. For a long moment, Sarah stared at the words, her heart racing. She wasn't ready to fully forgive him, but maybe, just maybe, she was ready to start rebuilding. Not just her relationship with Ethan, but with herself. Healing had begun. It was slow, uncertain, but it was real. And that was enough. The small cafe smelled of freshly ground coffee and baked pastries, a warm contrast to the chill of the early morning air. Sarah sat across from Ethan, her fingers wrapped around the mug of tea in front of her, the steam rising in gentle curls. The quiet hum of conversation around them felt distant, almost unreal, as she focused on the man sitting before her. Ethan had changed. She could see it in his eyes. Tired, worn, but also full of regret. I'm glad you came, Sarah said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. She wasn't sure what to expect, but this moment was one she couldn't ignore. Ethan had reached out to her, apologized, and now they were face to face, standing at the edge of a conversation neither of them had been ready for. I know I've hurt you, Mom. I've been thinking a lot about what I did, how I treated you, Ethan said, his voice low, almost apologetic. He met her gaze for a brief moment before looking down at his hands. I've been so overwhelmed with my own stuff, and I let it affect everything around me, especially you, and I'm sorry for that. Sarah listened, her chest tight. She had heard apologies before, but something in his voice, something in the vulnerability of his words, made her pause. I know you've been struggling, Ethan, she said carefully, choosing her words. But your actions hurt me. They made me feel invisible, like I didn't matter to you, and I can't just forget that. Ethan's eyes flickered with shame, his lips pressing together. I was selfish. I wasn't there when you needed me, and I took you for granted. I thought you'd always be there, and that was wrong. He stopped, his voice faltering. I'm sorry, Mom. Sarah took a deep breath. She had worked so hard to move beyond the hurt, to reclaim her own life after years of neglect. This apology, this rawness in him, was difficult to process. I don't know if I can go back to how things were, she said, her voice steady but firm. Forgiveness doesn't mean erasing the past. I've spent so much time trying to repair things, but I can't keep going back to that place where I'm constantly trying to fix what's broken between us." Ethan looked up, confusion in his eyes. "What do you mean? Do you want to move forward or not?" "I do want to move forward," Sarah said, her voice quieter now. "But I can't just go back to being the person who accepts everything no matter how much it hurts. I have to set boundaries. I need to protect myself from being hurt again." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan's eyes softened, his shoulders sagging as if a weight had been lifted. "I understand," he said quietly. "I respect that." Sarah exhaled, feeling the last remnants of her uncertainty fade. This wasn't the reunion she had once imagined, but maybe it didn't need to be. "I'm not asking for things to be perfect, Ethan," she said, her voice stronger now. "But I need to know that I'm not just a convenience when it's easy for you. I need to know that you respect me." "I do. I will," Ethan replied, his voice firm with newfound resolve. As Sarah stood to leave, she felt the first flicker of something real and true. It wasn't the ending she had hoped for, but it was a beginning, and that was enough. The cabin felt like home now, a sanctuary Sarah had created for herself, where the quiet mornings and slow, peaceful days gave her a sense of calm she hadn't felt in years. The weight of her past, of Ethan, of trying to meet everyone else's needs, had lightened. She no longer felt the constant pull to be everything for everyone. The space she had carved for herself was now filled with moments of solitude and clarity. Each day was a new step toward the woman she had become, strong, independent, and at peace. Ethan and Emily had respected her boundaries, but it hadn't been easy for either of them. Ethan was still learning how to navigate this new version of his mother, the one who didn't bend to his every demand. Emily had been cautious but supportive, acknowledging the change in Sarah's life. The awkwardness that had existed between them was slowly fading, replaced by a new understanding. They were both adjusting, learning to respect the woman Sarah had become. Grace had been the one constant through it all. She had always been there, a friend who saw Sarah for who she truly was. Not the caretaker, not the person defined by others' expectations, but Sarah. Together they spent hours walking the trails, sitting in quiet cafes and sharing their stories. With Grace, Sarah found a deeper connection, one built on mutual respect and shared experiences. It was with Grace's encouragement that Sarah began writing her memoir. At first, Sarah hesitated. Who would want to read her story? But as she wrote, she began to realize that her journey of self-reclamation wasn't just her own. It was a universal experience. The act of writing allowed Sarah to process her emotions and reflect on the transformation she had undergone, how she had found peace after so many years of internal conflict. When Sarah finally sent her manuscript to an editor, she was nervous, but the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Readers praised her honesty, her courage, and the raw truth of her story. Some even reached out to share their own journeys with her. Sarah was humbled. It felt as if her story had touched something deep within others, something she hadn't expected. The more she read their responses, the more she understood that peace didn't come from the external validation she had once sought. It came from knowing her worth, from accepting herself as she was. She had finally learned that she didn't need approval or apologies from anyone else to feel whole. One evening, as Sarah stood on her porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, she felt the weight of everything that had once held her down slip away. She had taken control of her life, rebuilt it piece by piece, and in doing so, had found something more important than reconciliation or validation. She had found peace within herself. And as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Sarah knew that the journey was far from over. But for the first time in years, she was excited to face whatever came next. She was ready. Sarah's life had shifted, and each day brought with it new signs of growth. She had spent so many years putting others first, but now she was learning how to make herself a priority. The woman who once worried about meeting everyone else's needs had begun to embrace self-love and independence. The space she had created for herself, quiet mornings in the cabin, long walks with Grace, had become her sanctuary, a place where she could breathe and truly be. She had become more than just a survivor. She was becoming a guide, sharing her journey with others who had walked similar paths. The memoir she had written wasn't just a story. It was a lifeline for others, a testament to the power of reclaiming your life. Speaking at local workshops, Sarah found herself offering guidance to those who, like her, had lost themselves in the roles others expected them to play. She didn't just want to share her story, she wanted to help others find the strength to live on their own terms. One day, Emily arrived at the cabin. Sarah hadn't heard from her in a while, and when she opened the door, she saw the hesitation in Emily's eyes. It was a different kind of visit this time, no longer about the chaos that had once defined their relationship, but about finding common ground. "Can we talk?" Emily asked softly. Sarah nodded, leading her into the living room where they both sat, the air between them heavy but not uncomfortable. Emily's voice was tentative, almost apologetic. "I've been thinking about everything, about how I've treated you, about how I didn't always respect your boundaries. I'm sorry for that, Sarah. I've been so wrapped up in my own life that I didn't see what you needed." Sarah felt a pang of sadness, but also a quiet relief. "I know, Emily, and I'm not angry anymore. I can't be the person I was. I can't be the one who keeps sacrificing herself for everyone else. I've had to learn to put myself first." Emily's eyes filled with understanding. "I get that. I've seen how much stronger you are. I don't want to lose you, but I understand if things aren't the same between us." Sarah took a deep breath, her heart softening. "We're different, and that's okay. I'm not the same person I was before, and I don't want to go back to that. But that doesn't mean we can't still be close. I just need to protect my peace." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the understanding between them unspoken but clear. Later, as Sarah packed for her next solo trip, a week in the desert, she felt the familiar excitement of independence bubbling inside her. This wasn't just another escape. It was a celebration of everything she had become. She was no longer defined by the past, by others' expectations. She was walking forward, fully herself, and ready for whatever came next. As she zipped up her suitcase, Sarah smiled softly. She was ready. The desert sun was sinking low, casting a warm glow over the rugged landscape. Sarah stood at the edge of the cliff, watching the colors shift across the sky. The silence around her felt profound, almost sacred. It was in these quiet moments that Sarah had come to understand something important. Peace didn't come from the approval of others. It came from within. And here, on this solitary trip, she was reminded of just how far she had come. Her phone buzzed, the soft vibration cutting through the stillness. She glanced down and saw a message from Ethan. Her heart gave a quiet flutter. It had been months since their last communication, but there had always been an unspoken question lingering. Could she forgive him? Could she ever move past the hurt he'd caused? She opened the message. "Sarah, I've been doing a lot of thinking. I know I hurt you and I can't take that back, but I've been working on myself. I've realized how much I took you for granted and how I let my own struggles hurt you. I see you now, and I understand what you've been through. I don't expect things to go back to the way they were, but I'm truly sorry. I miss you and hope we can rebuild something, just respect at the very least." Sarah held her breath as she read the words. There was no denying the sincerity in Ethan's message. He wasn't just apologizing. He was acknowledging the depth of his actions and the pain they had caused. Something inside her shifted, the old wounds no longer defining her, but slowly healing with time. She took a deep breath, the desert air filling her lungs. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't about going back. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about moving forward with respect. She didn't need him to be perfect, just real. She didn't need him to be the son he once was, but rather the man he was becoming. Sarah's fingers hovered over the phone screen as she typed her reply. "Ethan, I've been thinking a lot too. I forgive you. I know you've changed, and I can see the effort you've put in. But forgiveness doesn't mean erasing the past. It means understanding and moving forward. I'm ready to rebuild, but not by going back. It's about building, something new based on honesty and respect." She hit send, and the words felt like a weight lifting from her chest. The forgiveness wasn't for Ethan, it was for herself. She had carried the pain of their fractured relationship for far too long, and now she was choosing to let it go. She didn't need to fix the past, only to let it be. As Sarah turned away from the cliff, her heart felt lighter. She had come to terms with her past, learned to forgive, and found the peace she had longed for. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Sarah felt truly free. The sun sank below the horizon, the desert sky turning to deep shades of purple and gold. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to face it, with her own strength, with forgiveness, and with a heart open to what came next. Sarah stood at the podium, the room filled with the hum of eager voices. It was the first time in months that she had spoken to a crowd like this, but this time felt different. The nervous flutter in her chest was still there, but it didn't paralyze her as it once had. She had spoken at workshops before, sharing pieces of her story, but now she felt the weight of those words more deeply. She wasn't just talking about survival, she was talking about thriving. Looking out over the crowd, Sarah saw faces of all ages, all walks of life, some eager, some tentative, all searching for something she had learned to give herself, a sense of peace, strength, and empowerment. She smiled, finding her center before beginning. "We all carry pain, don't we?" she started, her voice steady but gentle. "We all carry the weight of what we've been through, what we've survived. But I'm here to tell you that healing is not about erasing the past. It's about embracing it and learning to live with it." The words flowed easily now, her heart and mind aligned in a way they hadn't been before. This wasn't just a lecture. It was a conversation with people who had been where she had, people who were now on their own path to healing. She spoke about the importance of boundaries, the lessons she'd learned about self-love, and the power of forgiveness. Not just for others, but for herself. As the session came to a close, a few attendees lingered to speak with her. She listened with care as they shared their own stories, their struggles and triumphs. In their words, Sarah saw reflections of her own journey. She realized how much of her healing had come from helping others, offering them the same wisdom she had fought to find. She was no longer just sharing her experiences. She was helping others shape their own paths. That evening, as Sarah walked back to her cabin, the world around her seemed brighter, clearer. The cabin, once a place of solitude and reflection, now felt like a launch pad for something bigger. She'd begun to see the world not as a place to hide from, but a place to experience fully. Her relationship with Ethan, too, had taken on a new shape, one that was healthier, grounded in mutual respect. Though they both had work to do, there was a sense of understanding between them that hadn't existed before. They were no longer bound by resentment. They were learning to build a new kind of connection. Her phone buzzed as she unlocked the door to the cabin, and a quick glance at the screen showed a message from Ethan. "I'm proud of you," it read. "I'm seeing things differently, and I just wanted to let you know that." For the first time in years, Sarah felt a swell of gratitude for the relationship they were slowly rebuilding. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. She responded with a simple, "Thank you," knowing that there was still so much to work through, but also knowing that they had crossed a threshold. As Sarah settled into her favorite chair by the fire, she reflected on how far she had come. She had rediscovered a love for life she hadn't realized she'd lost. She had stepped into the woman she was always meant to be, and now she was helping others do the same. Whether through workshops, personal connections, or her writing, Sarah was building a life where she no longer felt the need to shrink, to apologize, or to hide her true self. She was fully stepping into her power. The world seemed open to her now. She had new projects lined up, new paths to explore. The confidence she had built through years of struggle was now a part of her, inseparable, unshakable. And as she looked out at the darkening sky through the window, Sarah realized she wasn't waiting for permission to live her life anymore. She was living it fully on her own terms. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt truly alive, with a future full of promise, possibility, and peace. And as the stars began to twinkle above, she smiled, knowing that she was ready for whatever came next. The morning light poured through the window of Sarah's cabin, casting long shadows on the wooden floor. She sat at her desk, the quiet hum of the world outside breaking the stillness. A cup of tea rested by her side, the steam rising in gentle spirals as she stared at the page before her. She had been writing for hours, chronicling the last year of her life, the journey that had brought her from a place of pain to one of profound peace. As the words came, so did the memories. The difficult, heart-wrenching moments she had endured and the quiet victories she had claimed for herself. There was so much she had learned, so much she had grown through. She could still see the woman she used to be, the one who believed she had to be everything to everyone, who buried her own needs beneath layers of guilt and fear. That woman had seemed so fragile, so lost in the weight of others' expectations. But now, she could see the strength in her, the resilience that had always been there, waiting to rise. Her reflection on the journey was interrupted by the soft ping of a message on her phone. Sarah picked it up, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips as she read the message from Ethan. "I know I haven't always been the son you needed, but I want you to know that I see you now. You've done something I never thought possible. I'm proud of you. You've found the courage to live life on your own terms, and that's something I admire." The words, simple as they were, held a weight that Sarah could feel in her chest. There had been so many moments of silence between them, so many unspoken thoughts. But here it was, Ethan acknowledging her growth, her independence, and the woman she had become. She typed back, her fingers moving quickly. "Thank you, Ethan, I've come a long way. But I wouldn't have gotten here without learning to put myself first. I'm proud of the person I am now." As she set the phone down, Sarah allowed herself a moment to breathe. She had reconciled with him in her own way, but it wasn't about going back to the son she had once known. It was about creating something new. They weren't the same people they had been. They had both changed, and that was okay. Her mind wandered to Emily next. She had been Sarah's quiet rock throughout everything, and their bond had only grown stronger as Sarah learned to embrace her own independence. Emily had always been supportive, but now there was a deeper understanding between them. They were no longer tethered to the past, but moving forward, each with their own sense of purpose. Sarah closed her journal, looking out the window as the sun climbed higher in the sky. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction, something she hadn't known she'd been missing until she found it. There was a lightness to her heart, a freedom that came from embracing her own power. Her life, once defined by others, was now hers to shape. She had learned to live without the need for approval, without fear of disappointing anyone. She thought about the people she had helped, the faces of those who had attended her workshops, the stories shared between them. She had become more than a survivor. She had become a guide, a beacon for those who were still struggling, still searching for the strength to change. Her story had resonated with so many, and in return, it had helped her heal in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Grace, the one constant in Sarah's life. "I just wanted to remind you that you are incredible. You've built a life that's yours, and I'm so proud of you." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes, but she didn't fight them. They were tears of gratitude, of knowing that she was not alone on this journey. She had people who supported her, who saw her for who she truly was. And in the quiet peace of the moment, Sarah realized that this was the life she had fought for, the life she had created on her own terms. As she took a deep breath, Sarah thought back to all that she had lost, but more importantly, to all that she had found. The son she once knew was gone, but she had found something even more important: herself. I may have lost the son I once knew, she whispered to herself, but in the end, I found myself. And with that, Sarah stepped forward into the next chapter of her life, confident, at peace, and ready for whatever came next.